The Galactic Cooperative Educational Initiative, or GCEI, for those who valued their breath and sanity, was founded approximately 273 standard cycles ago on the rather optimistic premise that if you threw enough species into classrooms together, they'd eventually stop trying to conquer each other's homeworlds. The results were mixed, though statistically better than the alternative, which mostly involved plasma weapons and diplomatic incidents that required 17-page apology letters written in 4 different chemical communication systems. When humanity stumbled into the interstellar community some 15 years prior, smelling faintly of rocket fuel and hubris, the cooperative faced an interesting dilemma. Humans were, by all measurable standards, laughably fragile. Their bone density registered somewhere between embarrassing and concerning. Their atmospheric requirements were annoyingly specific. They couldn't even see in infrared or ultraviolet, which meant they bumped into things with depressing regularity. And yet, somehow, these soft little primates had clawed their way off a death world that classified as a Class 7 hazard zone, and insisted they deserved a seat at the big kids' table. The cooperative, in its infinite wisdom and finite patience, decided that integrating humans into the educational exchange program would be character building. For everyone involved, possibly therapeutic, definitely entertaining for the administrators who ran betting pools on which species would file the first formal complaint. The Zenthari Academy orbited a pleasant binary star system in neutral space, carefully positioned so no single species could claim territorial advantage. It was considered the crown jewel of interspecies education, boasting facilities that could accommodate everything from methane-breathing Skorthak to the silicon-based Vreni, who technically weren't alive by most definitions, but filled out paperwork beautifully. The architecture was aggressively neutral, all sweeping curves and adaptive environmental pods, designed by a committee that had argued for 6 years about appropriate door widths. It was here, in Combat Instruction Hall 7, that the incident occurred. Lieutenant Maya Reeves stood at exactly 5 feet 6 inches tall, which translated to slightly below average height for a human female and absolutely microscopic by the standards of most species represented in her classroom. She had the build of someone who'd spent years conditioning their body into a precision instrument, all functional muscle and economy of movement. With dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that suggested she'd seen some things and filed them under lessons learned rather than trauma requiring therapy. She'd been assigned to the Academy 6 months ago as part of Earth's contribution to the martial arts instruction program, which had been met with approximately the level of enthusiasm one might reserve for a child, insisting they could contribute to a construction project with a plastic hammer. The cooperative humored humanity's participation because refusing would have been diplomatically complicated, and because watching humans attempt to teach combat techniques to species who could bench press small vehicles had comedic value. Maya's class consisted of 47 students representing 12 different species, most of whom attended her sessions with the barely concealed amusement of adults watching a toddler explain quantum mechanics. There were the Kravik, hulking reptilians whose scales could deflect small arms fire, and who moved with the ponderous confidence of natural apex predators. The insectoid Chixar, whose reaction times operated on timescales that made human reflexes look like they were moving through honey. Several Quillian students, whose 4 arms and triple-jointed limbs gave them advantages in close combat that made human anatomy look like a design flaw. And a handful of other species, each of whom could, in theory, reduce Maya to a small smear on the floor without breaking whatever they had that approximated a sweat. Then there was Instructor Karvoth. Karvoth belonged to the Drakon, a species that had built an interstellar reputation on 3 things: military prowess, insufferable pride, and bone density that registered somewhere between titanium and neutron star material. He stood 9 feet tall with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian, possessed 4 arms that ended in claws, capable of rending ship hulls, and had eyes that glowed with bioluminescent contempt. He'd been teaching combat instruction at the academy for 20 years, had personally trained 3 generations of cooperative peacekeepers, and possessed the kind of ego that required its own gravitational field. He was also Maya's official supervisor, an arrangement that the administration insisted was about mentorship and cultural exchange, but which everyone understood was actually about making sure the human didn't accidentally get herself killed doing something stupid, like demonstrating a technique on a student who could sneeze her into paste. Carvoth treated this supervisory role with all the enthusiasm of a surgeon asked to babysit someone's pet hamster during brain surgery. The morning of the incident began unremarkably, which should have been everyone's first warning that the universe was winding up for something spectacular. Maya arrived at Combat Hall 7 at precisely 0600, as she did every morning, and began running through her warm-up routine while the environmental systems adjusted the gravity to standard cooperative baseline. She moved through forms with mechanical precision, each movement economical and purposeful, ignoring the way several early arriving students watched with barely concealed amusement. "Still doing your little dance, I see," rumbled a voice that sounded like an avalanche achieving consciousness and deciding to be condescending about it. Maya didn't break her form, flowing through a strike sequence before straightening and turning to face Carvoth. "Good morning, Instructor. Warming up before class. Standard protocol." Standard for whom? Carvoth's quad-jawed mouth pulled into what might have been a smile, if you were generous with your definitions. "Your physiology requires constant maintenance, just to avoid deteriorating. It's almost endearing how much effort you invest in remaining merely adequate." 6 months of this. 6 months of backhanded compliments, casual dismissals, and the kind of condescension that was technically professional enough to avoid filing formal complaints but made Maya's teeth hurt from clenching. She'd dealt with worse during her years in Earth's military, where the training instructors could insult you in ways that required counseling to fully unpack. But at least they'd respected competence when they saw it. "I manage," Maya said neutrally, which was the diplomatic way of saying several things that would have required those 17-page apology letters. Students filed in as the chronometer ticked toward 0630, filling the tiered observation areas around the central practice floor. Maya's roster showed 47 enrolled, and 46 were present, which was above average and suggested something interesting was happening. Students generally skipped classes they found boring, and the cooperative's educational philosophy leaned heavily toward letting participation be voluntary, on the grounds that forced attendance just bred resentment and poor combat form. The missing student was Thornick, one of the Kravik, who'd filed a grievance last week after Maya had successfully thrown him during a demonstration. The grievance had been dismissed. Technique was technique regardless of size differential. But Thornick's pride remained injured in ways the medical bay couldn't address. "Attention!" Maya called out, her voice carrying across the hall without shouting. Human vocal cords might have been unimpressive compared to species with multiple resonating chambers. But evolution had gifted humanity with remarkable projection for primates who'd learned to coordinate hunts across savanna distances. Today, we're covering escape techniques from rear grapples with superior mass opponents. A ripple of amusement moved through the students. Superior mass opponents meant basically everyone here except Maya, and watching her demonstrate techniques designed for fighting bigger enemies had entertainment value even if they didn't take the actual instructions seriously. Carvoth shifted his bulk, scales scraping against each other with a sound like swords being sharpened. "Actually, Lieutenant Reeves, I thought today might be an excellent opportunity for a collaborative demonstration." Maya's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted fractionally, weight distribution adjusting in ways that nobody who wasn't specifically trained to notice such things would catch. A collaborative demonstration. Indeed. Karvoth descended from his supervisory platform with surprising grace, for something built like a tank had mated with a dragon. You've been instructing these students for 6 months in human combat techniques, but I think they would benefit from seeing how those techniques perform against proper Dracon combat forms. Educational comparison. Translation. Karvoth wanted to humiliate her in front of the students, demonstrate that human techniques were as fragile as human bones, and reassert the natural order where species who'd evolved as apex predators didn't take instruction from species who'd barely survived long enough to invent agriculture. The students perked up immediately. This was better than the usual instruction. This was entertainment. Maya considered her options with the kind of rapid tactical assessment that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments in Earth's various peacekeeping disasters. She could decline, which would be professional and sensible, and would absolutely be interpreted as cowardice. She could accept and pull her techniques, which would be safe and boring and would waste everyone's time. Or she could accept and commit fully, which would be dangerous and interesting and might finally make a point that 6 months of professional competence hadn't managed to communicate. I think that's an excellent idea, Instructor Karvoth, Maya said pleasantly. What parameters did you have in mind? Karvoth's glow intensified slightly, which was Dracon for smug satisfaction. Simple demonstration. I'll apply a standing rear grapple with arm control. You demonstrate your escape technique. Standard training intensity, of course. We wouldn't want any accidents. Standard training intensity for a Dracon meant force that would liquefy human organs. But Karvoth's tone suggested he believed he was being generous. The students shifted forward in their seats, attention fully focused now. Several were already recording, because interspecies incidents made for excellent social media content and got enormous engagement metrics across the cooperative networks. Maya moved to the center of the practice floor, rolling her shoulders and shaking out her hands. Whenever you're ready, Instructor. Karvoth circled her like a predator assessing prey, which was probably instinctive behavior for Dracon, but came across as deeply condescending when performed by a 9-foot apex predator around a human woman who barely reached his mid-torso. He positioned himself behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his scales, and his 4 arms moved with practiced precision. 2 arms locked around her torso, pinning her arms to her sides with pressure that immediately made breathing difficult. The other 2 secured her shoulders, claws resting against her collarbones with just enough pressure to be threatening without breaking skin. It was technically a training hold, the kind instructors used to demonstrate control without injury, except Karvoth applied it with force that suggested he'd forgotten what standard human tolerances were or didn't particularly care. Notice the control, Karvoth announced to the class, his voice vibrating through Maya's ribcage. 4-point lock on the torso and shoulders. The subject is completely immobilized. Human techniques emphasize leverage and joint manipulation, but such methods become ineffective when the opponent has proper mass and limb advantage. Lieutenant Reeves, please demonstrate your escape technique. Maya tested the hold, feeling the pressure points and angle restrictions. Karvoth had positioned himself correctly for Dracon grappling doctrine, which emphasized overwhelming force and limb redundancy. Against another Dracon, this hold would require specific counter techniques that played to species-specific flexibility advantages. Against most other species, it was genuinely difficult to escape without cooperation from the person applying it. Against a human, it was a tactical error. The primary weakness of multi-limb grappling, Maya said conversationally, her voice only slightly strained by the pressure on her ribs, is that it requires commitment of multiple limbs to maintain control. This creates timing windows during transition phases and locks the opponent into predictable response patterns. She shifted her weight, dropping her center of gravity and turning the pressure on her ribs from crushing force into structural loading. Karvoth compensated automatically, adjusting his grip, which was exactly what she'd anticipated. His upper arms tightened to maintain shoulder control, which fractionally loosened the lock on her torso. That was the window. Maya exploded into motion with the kind of violence that made spectators flinch. She dropped her full weight suddenly, breaking Karvoth's postural stability, then drove her heel into his knee joint with force generated from hip rotation and spite. The Dracon's leg buckled slightly. Not much. His bone density made damaging him genuinely difficult. But enough to shift his balance. She twisted hard, accepting the pressure spike on her ribs as an acceptable cost, and got one arm partially free. Karvoth snarled, recovering faster than most species could process sensory input, and adjusted his grip with the kind of speed that made his reputation as a combat instructor well-deserved. His upper right arm released her shoulder and moved to secure her head, establishing a neck control that would end the demonstration decisively. His hand closed on her right wrist instead, which had somehow gotten in the way during his grip transition. He squeezed, applying what he probably considered moderate force. The kind of pressure that would make a student submit and learn respect for Dracon's strength. The crack echoed through Combat Hall 7 with perfect acoustic clarity, sharp and clean and unmistakable. It was the sound of human, bone experiencing rapid structural failure, of Radius and Ulna deciding they'd had enough of their current configuration and opting for something more abstract. Maya's wrist broke. The room went silent except for the hum of environmental systems and someone's recording device automatically adjusting focus. 46 students held their collective breath, waiting for the human to scream or cry or do whatever humans did when their fragile skeletons failed. Karvoth released his grip, stepping back with an expression that might have been concern if you were generous or satisfaction if you were honest. "Well," he rumbled, "perhaps that demonstrates the fundamental problem with human physiology in combat scenarios. Your species simply lacks the structural integrity for proper..." Maya's left hand shot up and secured a grip on Karvoth's throat before he finished his sentence. The thing about human anatomy that most species didn't appreciate was that evolution had gifted humanity with remarkable grip strength relative to body mass. Humans were persistence hunters, primates who'd learned to hang from things and throw things and strangle things with hands that had evolved for precision work but maintained surprising crushing power. Maya's left hand, driven by muscles conditioned through years of training and a really impressive amount of annoyance, locked onto Karvoth's throat with pressure that made his bioluminescent eyes widen. She didn't squeeze hard enough to damage anything. Dracon tracheal cartilage could probably survive atmospheric re-entry. But she established control, which was the point. Her broken right wrist dangled at an angle that made several students experience sympathetic nausea. But Maya's expression suggested she'd filed this under minor inconvenience rather than medical emergency. She pivoted, using Karvoth's own mass against him, applying techniques that had been developed by humans fighting enemies with superior size and strength for approximately all of human history. Karvoth grabbed for her with 3 of his 4 arms, but Maya was already moving, flowing through the kind of close-quarters combat sequence that looked less like martial arts and more like applied physics with malicious intent. She used his reach against him, staying inside his striking envelope where his mass became a disadvantage. Her broken wrist swung like a morbid pendulum, but she didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. Fought through pain that would have dropped most species into shock. She got behind him, properly behind him this time, and executed a technique that had been developed by humans centuries ago for dealing with armored opponents who outmassed them by hundreds of pounds. It involved leverage points, weight distribution, and understanding exactly how vertebrae connected to skulls across most bilateral anatomies. The technical term was a cervical spine manipulation. The informal term, used by humans who didn't have time for proper medical terminology during combat, was a neck snap. Maya applied it with textbook precision. Karvoth went down like a collapsing building, forearms flailing, scales scraping across the practice floor with a screech that made teeth hurt. He landed face first, gasping, his bioluminescent eyes flickering in patterns that probably indicated neurological confusion or profound shock or both. He wasn't dead. Dracon neurology included redundant nerve clusters that made killing them through neck trauma genuinely difficult without dedicated equipment. But he was definitely experiencing an unscheduled malfunction of his motor control systems and would require medical attention immediately, if not sooner. Maya stood over him, breathing hard, her broken wrist cradled against her torso, and addressed the class with the same conversational tone she'd used to discuss lunch options. Human combat doctrine, she said, operates on 3 fundamental principles. First, pain is just sensory information. It tells you something is damaged, but it doesn't stop you from functioning unless you let it. Second, acceptable damage thresholds are higher than you think. Broken bones are temporary. Death is permanent. You can fight through one, but not the other. Third, humans don't stop. She looked down at Karvoth, who was making sounds like a malfunctioning engine and trying to remember how voluntary muscle control worked. We evolved as persistence hunters. We chased prey until it died of exhaustion. We survived on a planet that tried very hard to kill us through predators, disease, weather, and each other. We learned that the fight doesn't end because you're hurt. It ends when you've won or you're dead. And evolution weeded out the genetics that gave up in the middle. Maya grabbed her broken wrist with her functional hand and, without changing expression, pulled it straight with a crunch that made half the students look away. The bone ends grated against each other, sending signals to her brain that strongly suggested this was a terrible idea. But she'd learned years ago that pain was negotiable if you had enough adrenaline and spite. Medical team to combat Hall 7, she said clearly, her voice carrying to the hall's communication system. Instructor Karvoth requires immediate attention for cervical trauma. Non-lethal but urgent. She walked calmly to the equipment storage, retrieved a basic field immobilizer with her functioning hand, and began applying it to her broken wrist with the kind of casual competence that suggested she'd done this before. Possibly more than once. Possibly more than was psychologically healthy. The students sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. Several species didn't have adrenal systems, and were trying to understand how Maya was still conscious, let alone upright and providing first aid to herself. The Chickasaw were clicking to each other in patterns that probably translated to variations on what the actual hell just happened. The Kravik looked like they were reconsidering several fundamental assumptions about prey species and proper respect protocols. The medical team arrived within 3 minutes. The Academy maintained excellent emergency response times after an incident involving a Skorthak chemistry experiment, and loaded Karvoth onto an anti-grav stretcher while looking at Maya with expressions that suggested they weren't sure whether to treat her or study her for science. "Ma'am, you need immediate medical attention." The head medic, a Quillian named Rixith, insisted while scanning Maya's wrist with equipment that beeped in alarm patterns. "You've sustained a complete bilateral fracture of the radius and ulna with significant soft tissue damage. You should be unconscious from shock. I'm aware of the damage assessment, Maya said calmly. I can feel it breaking. But the bone regenerator in your medical bay can handle this in about 4 hours, and I have a class to finish teaching. You have a what? A class to finish. Maya turned back to her students, holding up her immobilized wrist. Who can identify the tactical errors Instructor Karvoth made during our demonstration? Nobody answered. 46 students stared at her like she'd spontaneously developed extra heads or announced her intention to wrestle a star. Maya waited patiently. Teaching was about creating space for students to process information, even when that information involved watching their instructor break a supervisor's neck with a broken wrist and then calmly continuing class like this was normal. Finally, one of the Kravik, Venner, who'd been consistently attentive despite the species-wide tendency toward casual arrogance, raised a clawed hand hesitantly. He, underestimated your pain tolerance. Partially correct, Maya acknowledged. More specifically, he made tactical assumptions based on species-typical responses to trauma. Most species experience overwhelming pain from broken bones and cease combat operations. Humans, due to our evolutionary history and neurological architecture, can compartmentalize pain signals and continue functioning. This creates tactical surprise. Another hand, this time from a Chickasaw. He didn't expect you to immediately counterattack? Correct. When applying joint locks or submission holds, most species signal submission through stillness or vocalization. Humans have been selected by evolution to hide injury responses during critical survival moments. We freeze-mask our pain, assess tactically, then respond with maximum violence before the opponent realizes we're still a threat. A Quillian student, her forearms gesturing in what was probably her species' version of raising a hand enthusiastically. He assumed his superior bone density made him immune to human techniques? Excellent observation. Dracon bones are approximately 8 times denser than human bones. However, the connection points between bones, joints, spinal articulation, limb, anchoring, operate on similar biomechanical principles across most bilateral species. You can't strengthen those connection points beyond certain thresholds without compromising mobility. Techniques that target those connection points remain effective regardless of bone density. The medical team was still hovering uncertainly, clearly wanting to drag Maya to the medical bay, but also apparently unwilling to physically grab her after watching what she'd done to Karvoth. Rixith tried a different approach. Lieutenant Reeves, regulations require immediate medical intervention for injuries of this severity. Noted. I'll report to medical bay during the scheduled break between classes. Current priority is educational continuity. Maya fixed the medic with a look that suggested arguing would be inadvisable. Unless you're prepared to declare me medically unfit for duty, in which case I'll need that determination in writing from the chief medical officer. Rixith's forearms drooped in defeat. Nobody wanted to deal with the paperwork of declaring a human unfit for duty, particularly when said human was standing upright and teaching class with a broken wrist like it was a minor inconvenience. The medical team retreated with Karvoth, who'd regained enough neurological function to groan in patterns that suggested he was reconsidering many of his recent life choices. Maya continued teaching. For the remaining 73 minutes of the scheduled class period, she demonstrated escape techniques, proper weight distribution for fighting larger opponents, and targeting strategies for critical joints across different species anatomies. She did this with one functional hand and a broken wrist that was swelling impressively despite the immobilizer, maintaining the same professional competence she demonstrated for 6 months, except now the students actually paid attention. They took notes. They asked questions. They tried the techniques with each other with a level of seriousness that suggested they'd finally internalized that maybe, possibly. The small human instructor knew what she was talking about. When the chronometer hit 0800 and class ended, none of the students left immediately. Several approached Maya with questions that ranged from technical to existential. "Is it true humans can run for days without stopping?" asked Venner. Persistence hunting typically involves 8 to 12 hours of continuous tracking and running, sometimes longer depending on prey species and terrain. The current human ultra-marathon record is approximately 5 days of continuous running, though that's extreme even by human standards. How much pain can humans tolerate before combat effectiveness drops? From one of the Chickasaw. That's individual dependent and training dependent. But field studies suggest humans can maintain combat effectiveness with injuries that would incapacitate most species. Compound fractures, severe lacerations, partial limb loss. Historical combat records document humans continuing to fight with damage that should theoretically render them non-functional. "Why didn't you stop when your wrist broke?" asked a Quillian student quietly. Maya considered the question seriously. Because stopping wasn't tactically advantageous. Instructor Carvoth had committed to a demonstration intended to prove human inferiority. Stopping would have confirmed his assumptions and wasted 6 months of instruction. Continuing and winning made a point that words couldn't accomplish. "That seems," the student hesitated, searching for appropriate terminology, "psychologically abnormal." By most species standards, yes. By human standards, it's called having a working adrenal system and severe irritation. We're a spite-driven species with pain tolerance shaped by millions of years of surviving on a death world. We're not psychologically normal by any reasonable definition. The students processed this with expressions that suggested they were recalibrating their understanding of humanity from fragile weaklings to something more concerning. News of the incident spread through the academy with the speed of scandalized gossip amplified by communication technology. By midday, the recording had been viewed approximately 40,000 times across academy networks. By evening, it had jumped to cooperative-wide networks and accumulated 3 million views, with commentary from combat analysts, xenobiologists, and various species offering opinions ranging from impressed to horrified. The administrative response was predictably bureaucratic. Maya spent 2 hours in the medical bay, getting her wrist regenerated, while administrators argued about appropriate disciplinary action, protocol violations, and whether defending yourself when someone broke your wrist during a training exercise counted as excessive force or justified response. The Dracon contingent demanded Maya's immediate expulsion for assaulting a senior instructor. The human delegation pointed out that Carvoth had initiated the physical confrontation, applied excessive force resulting in injury, and that Maya's response was consistent with human self-defense doctrine. Several neutral species suggested maybe everyone could calm down and remember that the entire incident had been recorded and showed pretty clearly who escalated what. Eventually, after 6 hours of committee meetings that probably violated several workplace safety regulations regarding reasonable meeting duration, the administration issued their official decision. No disciplinary action for Maya. Mandatory joint training protocols review for all combat instructors. And a strongly worded memo about respecting species-typical pain tolerance variations. Carvoth recovered fully within 8 hours. Dracon neurological redundancy was genuinely impressive, and immediately filed for reassignment to any facility that didn't contain humans. His request was approved with what several administrators privately admitted was unseemly haste. The Academy's combat instruction program underwent immediate revision. Suddenly, human pain tolerance and persistence hunting became required study topics. Several departments requested human guest lecturers to discuss Earth's evolutionary history and survival adaptations. The medical bay updated its trauma protocols to include special notes about human damage thresholds and the phrase, "Please verify the human is actually unconscious," before assuming they're non-functional. Maya's subsequent classes were packed beyond capacity, with students from disciplines completely unrelated to combat instruction attending just to watch a human teach. Her reputation shifted from amusing curiosity to someone you absolutely did not want to fight unless you enjoyed surprise neck injuries. 3 weeks after the incident, Maya received official notification that Earth's military had requested her input on revised training protocols for human instructors at cooperative facilities. Apparently, her demonstration had sparked interest from multiple species militaries about incorporating human endurance tactics into their standard operating procedures. She also received approximately 200 interview requests from cooperative media outlets, all of which she declined on grounds that her wrist was still technically healing and she had classes to teach. Thornick, the Kravik student who'd filed a grievance about being thrown, quietly withdrew his complaint and returned to class. He even apologized, which was apparently significant for Kravik, who traditionally considered apologies a sign of weakness. He explained that he'd reconsidered his position after watching the recording 17 times and consulting with his clutch elders, who'd informed him that surviving being thrown by something that could break its own bones and keep fighting was actually an honor, and he should stop being a hatchling about it. The Zenthari Academy settled into a new equilibrium, one where humanity's presence was taken slightly more seriously, and human instructors were approached with the kind of cautious respect previously reserved for species with natural weapons and concerning predatory instincts. 6 months later, the cooperative formally requested that Earth provide additional combat instructors to supplement training at facilities across neutral space. The official request emphasized humanity's unique perspective on asymmetric combat, damage tolerance, and psychological resilience. The unofficial commentary suggested that having humans demonstrate techniques provided excellent motivation for students to take training seriously, since nobody wanted to be the person who lost a fight to something that could break like porcelain but refused to stop moving. Maya eventually accepted a promotion to senior instructor and began developing curriculum specifically focused on human combat philosophy for interspecies audiences. She maintained her policy of demonstrating techniques herself, though the administration instituted new protocols requiring medical staff on standby during any demonstration involving senior instructors from species with significant mass or density advantages. Her course, formally titled Asymmetric Combat Strategies for Variable Physiology Engagements, became informally known as How Humans Won't Stop Even When You Break Their Bones, and was consistently oversubscribed every semester. The Galactic Cooperative quietly updated its threat assessment protocols for Earth, noting that while humans remained physically fragile by most species standards, they possessed psychological and neurological adaptations that made them significantly more dangerous than initial assessment suggested. The updated files included detailed notes about human pain tolerance, persistence hunting evolution, and a highlighted section that essentially said, "Do not assume a human is non-functional just because they're injured. Verify they're actually unconscious or dead before proceeding." And somewhere in Combat Hall 7, on a wall dedicated to memorable Academy moments, someone had mounted a small plaque. It didn't commemorate Karvoth's years of distinguished service or his numerous military honors. Instead, it marked the exact spot where he'd learned that breaking a human's bones was easy, but stopping a human once they decided to end you was considerably more difficult. The plaque read, "Pain is just information. Humans negotiated better terms." Underneath, in smaller text. Also, maybe don't break your colleague's wrist during a demonstration unless you're prepared to have a really bad day immediately afterward. The galaxy had learned something valuable. Fragility wasn't weakness. pain wasn't defeat, and humanity's classification as a non-threatening species required significant revision. Humans wouldn't outfight you through superior strength or speed or natural weapons. They just refused to stop until the fight was over, accepting damage that should end combat operations, and continuing anyway through what could only be described as weaponized stubbornness and evolutionary spite. It was a lesson that most species only needed to learn once, preferably through recorded demonstration rather than personal experience. Though a few stubborn individuals still required hands-on instruction. Maya continued teaching, her wrist healed completely, her reputation thoroughly established, and her class roster permanently full of students who'd realized that sometimes the most dangerous opponents were the ones who looked breakable, but absolutely refused to acknowledge that breaking was supposed to stop them. The cooperative buzzed with new understanding, awkward apologies, and revised protocols. And humanity smiled its persistence hunter smile, the one that said, "We survived the Ice Age and saber-toothed cats in each other," and noted that they'd been trying to explain this for 15 years, but apparently, demonstration was more effective than documentation. Some lessons, the galaxy learned, required breaking bones to properly teach. The trick was making sure you broke the right bones, taught the right lesson, and remained upright enough afterward to confirm everyone understood the material. Class dismissed.